All right, so in this last part of exercise 3, guys, we're going to look at some advanced animation techniques. There's also something that I want to cover in here as far as working with your layers that was not covered prior. As far as like taking layers and consolidating them for easier timeline work. So if you have multiple layers, you want to merge them together. That's actually a process called nesting inside of time-based media software. So I'll show you how to do that. It's pretty easy, and it's also pretty handy, again, when trying to animate several things together and keep them without being like 40 tracks long on the main timeline. But we'll look at some advanced animation now. We'll look at things like keyframe interpolation, motion sketching, how to convert audio into keyframes, and understanding things like motion paths. So let's jump into that. All right. So back in the timeline, let me see if I can get my everything here kind of zoomed out so I can see it all. So a couple example things that I want to show you in the timeline here as far as adding some advanced level animation to work inside here. And again, anything that you learn with animating in After Effects basically can apply to any type of animation in After Effects after this. So whether it's an audio effect that you're animating, or it's a video effect you're animating, or if it's just making something move on screen, they all work together pretty much the same way. So what I'm going to do to actually give you an example of that, I'm going to work with just kind of an independent shape, a new shape to throw into my design just for exampling this. So I'm just going to start with down here at the bottom with my last wave file selected, and I'm going to create a new layer, and it'll pop up right above it. Is how it works in After Effects. So it always drops new layers above the last selected one. So I'll drop in an empty shape layer, and I'm going to add a polygon. And I'm going to draw it on screen here, and then I'm going to solo it after I drop it in. So I'm going to hit the little solo key. That way everything else is just kind of turned off for the moment. Okay. Quick thing to notice when you drop in new shapes like that, make sure that you get the anchor point centered on the shape. This anchor point, this little floating crosshair circle, represents the position of transformation for the entire layer. So it will shrink in towards that point from all sides. It will rotate about the location of that point, and it will read the position of the layer from that point. If you want to change it, it's not hard to do if you're working with it again on the entire layer. You can come up here to your toolbar, and there's an icon up here called Pan Behind or Anchor Tool. You can click on that and then come out to your timeline or out to your comp window and click and drag on this little cursor, and it will move it around on screen and reposition it. And there, you can get it kind of semi-recentered. All right, got that dropped in. Good. So a couple things that I want to show you here. We're going to work with this shape and kind of play with animating it a few different ways inside the timeline to see what we can do with it. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink it down a little bit. So I'm going to go to my contents, and I'm going to scale it down. Start with a small object, and I'm going to start with it up here in the upper corner. Now we know some basic things that we can do with animation at this stage in the game. Like I know that I can turn on a stopwatch to activate its keyframes, and I can drag the playhead forward and then move my object to automatically generate a brand new keyframe because I've changed the values for something that's activated. So now if I run my playhead back and hit space, the object goes somewhere, right? Okay. I know. Aren't those great sounds? So you've got that going on, right? Like that's a basic, right? Animation basic right there. Now, there are some things that we can do to actually adjust the rate at which it moves from or accelerates and decelerates from keyframe to keyframe. This is called interpolation, or also understood as easing. This is another sort of basic animation tool that's used a lot to sort of help simulate a little bit more reality or a little bit more life into an object. So it doesn't look so mechanical when it slides, and so even and perfect. So we're going to play around with that a little with the keyframes. So I've got these two keyframes in, and it is sliding from one side of the screen to the other for over a period of about 5 seconds. All right, so here's how we can change up or ease out from one keyframe and then ease into another one. So I'm going to select my first keyframe by clicking on it with my mouse. I'm going to go up to where it says Animation on the top menu bar. And then I'm going to slide down to Keyframe Assistant. Under Keyframe Assistant, I have some options in here like Easy Ease In, Easy Ease Out. That's a lot of easy sounds. For now, we're just going to say ease. So these tell me basically how it interprets the movement of or the change in values as it moves into a new keyframe. So we're going to set this first one for it to ease away from the frame or out from the frame so that it accelerates into a normal speed. So I'm going to do easy ease out. And what it did on my timeline is it converted the shape of my keyframe into a back-turned arrow that's facing towards the left. So that indicates an ease out. And so if I hit play on that, what it will do, what it's going to do on screen is it's going to take that particular keyframe. Sorry, I just kind of minimized all of that. So it's going to basically slowly speed up and move across the screen. Now it does it very quickly because of the distancing here, but you can kind of notice that it starts really slow and then kind of picks up a little bit of pace. Now it still ends kind of mechanically on the other side and stops really flat. We can also get it to ease into this position. So to do that, I'm going to select this keyframe, go back to Animation, and go back to Assistant, Keyframe Assistant, and I'm going to use Ease In. So now it's going to ease into or decelerate into that keyframe. And we're just going to mute the audio for now. It's fun, but it gets really weird after listening to it a few times. All right, does everybody see how that worked out? So you kind of saw the shape kind of slowed down into its final spot and sped up very slowly. So this gives the shape a little bit more of a realistic kind of movement approach. Just like when a car stops, it does not stop flat. It has to decelerate some. Or even when you're running, like your body will not just suddenly stop flat like a robot. I mean, if you just dead stop, you'll probably fall down and roll and, you know, break a bone maybe, or scratch yourself up pretty bad. So rather than doing that, let's animate it, right? So that's how you can kind of get things to ease together. Now it gets more entertaining when you add more keyframes to the action. So let's say I move my playhead somewhere around the middle here, or even I'm going to navigate between my keyframes for a second. And I'm going to drag out this last keyframe a little bit further so that it comes into a little slower. And I might even change up where the object ends. So I'll just have it end in this corner. So right now it just goes side to side, no big deal. Let's have it loop in the middle. So I'm going to drag my playhead between the keyframes. And I'm going to drag my object down. And now I should get a nice little loop. So now when I play it back, oh yeah, notice this in the timeline. See the new keyframe it dropped? It's kind of a funky hourglass, right? So this is also this is what's called an easy ease keyframe, where it's sort of, it basically what it's doing is that it is easing into the keyframe and then it is easing out from it at the same time. So that's where it's going to kind of notice that it will approach it and it's going to round off the approach. So see how it comes in and just kind of loops around. So we get a nice, smooth, even motion whenever it works through those collections of keyframes. Now, some fun things to notice down here in the timeline that you can also do to manipulate keyframes. If you recall, again, the closer the keyframes are together, the faster they'll go, the change will be. So if I had to do it, one way I could do it is drag each of these back towards the front, or I could do them all locked ratio and drag them all back at the same time. And this only works if you have like more than 3 or more keyframes. But I'm going to drag them all, so I'm going to drag a little selection around them. And I'm going to hold down the Option key on the keyboard, and I'm going to click on the last keyframe and drag. And notice how all of them move together now. So now it's a locked ratio adjustment. So I can actually get a much more even shortening of the animation, and it's less sloppy for timing just by doing that. So now if I play it back, now it should move a little bit faster. A little more interesting. And I may even bring them in a little bit closer. So now it should kind of zip along a little bit. There we go. And that gives me a little bit of working with keyframe interpolation. Now you can do this with any keyframing you do in After Effects if you want to smooth out the changes between movement or even color shifting. If you're animating color in an object, you can easy ease the changes so that it's a little bit more flowy instead of robotic. Again, depending on your need inside of your design. But you can always select as many keyframes as you want and go up to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, and then you can use the easing options. All right. Now, there's another effect that you can also implement on a layer called blurring, or layer blurring, motion blur. This is kind of fun because it actually adds, again, another layer of potential sort of visual illusion of reality to an animation, which again can make it more visually interesting. It's just by adding a little bit of blur. Now, After Effects has an automatic blur feature that you can turn on using your layer switches, your basic layer switches. And it will implement an amount of blur depending on the shift or the amount of value shift between two keyframes. So if it's really dramatic, like it's a big value change, like an object that grows from super huge to microscopic, you will see an obvious blur on screen occur from that change. Or especially if you have an object rotating, you can also see it too if it spins super fast. So here, I'm going to turn it on. To find motion blur, it's these 3 little icons. It's part of this little group right here for any layer that you have active, or at least visual layer. If you don't see these, it's because that mode is turned off in the lower left. It's the first icon down here in the lower left of After Effects. So I'm going to turn it on for this layer. And when you turn that on, it doesn't actually enable the effect for the whole timeline. It just enables the effect for that layer. But if you want the effect to be visible in playback, you have to turn it on up here above your timeline. There's a giant icon that looks like 3 overlapping circles that's just like the 3 overlapping circles of the motion blur icon. So you turn it on for the layers or any layers you want it to play in, and then you also enable it for the whole timeline up here so that anytime you have it on, you can preview it that way. Or if you want to save RAM, you can turn it off temporarily. That's why they have the big switch. All right, so now that I have that on, now I can preview my animation again and see if I get some motion blur. Now here's the interesting thing. Again, like it does work great off of dramatic changes, but if I deselect, you can tell that there's a little bit of blur around my object. Now my animation is not making big enough of a transition for it to really enhance it. So I'm just going to drag in, lock the ratio with Option, and drag on this last keyframe to accentuate it even further so that I can try to really push how much it blurs this little shape. They do have special filters, by the way, for adding additional motion blur in After Effects. But this is kind of a basic one that's easy to access, and you don't have to change too many things to make it work. Okay, so now if I play it back, it'll move pretty quickly. And there's a smidge amount of blur. It's still kind of hard to see, so I'm going to go ahead and actually change the scale of my object. Sometimes that helps. With the larger it gets, sometimes the more motion blur it'll also give off. And let's see, that's how much we've got so far. All right. So we get a smidge of motion blur with this size object and the particular effect we're working with. So it gets, again, it can be more accentuated with different things that you turn on or different effects that you use. But it's all based on movement, is what motion blur works off of, is layer movement. So the more, again, the more extreme the movement, the more blur you get out of it. Now, that being said, there are other things that we can turn on inside here. Like I can actually have this object spin in what they call 2.5 3D space. So, or 2.5D space, or 3D. So I'm going to convert this into a 3D layer. So I'm going to take it and turn on this little switch box below this cube for the same layer. And it gives me a little XYZ thing on screen, which we may all recall from Blender. And I'm going to go down to my transform commands for the whole layer. And under that shape layer, I now have, notice how I have rotation, but I can do it on X, Y, and Z. So I can now make it spin. So on screen now, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of a spinning animation to the object. So I'm going to first animate it on the X. Let's turn off the keyframes, flip it forward, and I'm going to adjust the X rotation, which is that's complete circles. So I'm going to make it do 5 complete rotations. Now you can watch what it did. Now this gets crazy because it's rotating. Remember that little anchor point? I told you everything controls that wherever it rotates. So it's rotating about this. So watch this. See that? Pretty cool. A little more wily. Looks like a very insane firefly. You know, just had a coffee or 12 for the day. But you can kind of see, like, whenever you enact 3D on it, it gives it again, it works in the third dimension to play off of. And again, this is rotating about this, so it's a little more insane than normal. But you can get some pretty interesting effects just by enacting some of that stuff on screen. And that's just from adding this little 3D effect icon. Now, again, that does put more at play in the processor. The more layers you have that are using 3D, it does take longer for the computer to deal with that. All right? So be careful with how much of that you throw into your design. But you can get cool stuff. Like if you add 3D, there's all kinds of things you can leverage in After Effects, like 3D lights, shadows, blah, blah, blah. But again, kind of be careful with how much of that you play off of, because that you can sink in pretty deep pretty quick with that. Simple stuff like this is not bad, though, where you just animate on the transforms. Okay. So that's just kind of adding something like that to your object. Now you can see the motion blur is now heavily affected when that object goes through here. Like we can see very evident pathways of motion where the object is being almost lost visually because of how much bouncing around it's doing. All right. So that's kind of working with some of the little layer switch options that you can play with, like motion blur or with the 3D convert layer to 3D effect. Another one that I want to show you, and I'm going to use a separate shape layer to do this, or a regular solid. Let me drop in a solid here. Let's make it blue. Easy on the eyes. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add 1 or 2 of the different audio spectrum effects to this so you can see how audio can be animated to affect a visual property on screen. So first off, let's look at the effect and presets available. So if I type in spectrum or spec in the search box for special effects, there's one here called audio spectrum. I'm going to add it to my layer. I'm going to just double click it to my selected layer. And audio spectrum will basically replace the imagery for whatever layer it's applied to. And it puts over the top of it this little long line of purple dots for now, or pink dots for now. And you can actually reposition them by adjusting these little circles on screen to show where the dots stretch to. But these dots represent the position of the audio spectrum that will be visualized. So I have that dropped in. I get a ton of settings over here in the effect controls window that pops up for this particular special effect. And I'm just going to adjust a couple of these so we can see them, like the thickness. I'm going to enhance a smidge so you can see that line a little better. I'm going to associate an audio layer with this effect. So that's how this works. So right here at the top it says audio layer to reference. You pick one from your list. Hopefully you have one. And I'm going to pick this module production element. And I want to make sure that my module layers are turned on so that I can hear them. All right, so I got module production element up. I'm going to also change one other setting before I get it going. See where it says maximum height? I'm just going to make a small adjustment to that. So now when I play it back, so you can kind of see it's manipulating the audio waveform as the track plays behind it. Okay, so I've got that kind of rolling. Now it's not very dramatic yet, but I can change things like max height. Like here I can stretch out the audio form so it's really obvious. And this will make a basic waveform analyzer or spectrum analyzer. Now other things you can change on here that are kind of fun, like frequency bands. That's how many of these little vertical lines are present. You can reduce it to have just a handful. If you want it kind of be a really reductive kind of form. You can add more, as many as you need even on screen to really increase it. So it can be more of a solid looking shape. Again, you can also reposition it on screen. You can also recolor it if you want to, so you don't have to use the standard colors they give you. Do what? Yeah, the outside color is still pink. You know, you can change that too. So we can make it something else. It gives you that ability so you can make it kind of glow if you want to. If you don't want that, you just turn the softness effect all the way down to 0. And then it's just a straight line shape. But we can change those things that it reacts to. We can also change the frequency levels that it reads. So you can limit it to reading just the bass noises or just the treble frequency levels. We can also change the way it's displayed down at the bottom. So right now it's digitized, but we could change it to analog lines. So when it plays, they bounce around on both sides of the line. Or analog dots, which is kind of fun. And these are your dots. See that? It's mesmerizing, right? Hi, kid.
Waveforms count as animation?
Yeah, this counts as an animated tool as part of it. Now here's where it gets more fun, because you can do that and it gives you a straight line, right? Like straight line effect is what we're getting. Well, you can actually tell it to wrap this effect around a shape design instead. So if you've drawn a form inside of After Effects, or a mask actually, we can apply it, see where it says path right here? We can apply it to a mask on this layer. So I'm going to draw a quick mask, just something. Use my pen tool here and draw freely. We'll make a little heart, right? Oh. Okay, so I'll use that. So I'm going to go to where it says path, reference the mask. Notice how it's wrapped around it now. And we'll hit play. Yeah. So you can kind of see what happens when you do that. And that's just kind of playing, again, that's kind of playing around with just some of the little checks and things that you can play with in here, changing up the settings a bit. Again, it's all based on that, or the digital line gets even more crazy looking. Now obviously it's even more fun because a mask can also be animated point to point, so you could make it move around on screen if you wanted to. But that kind of gives you an idea with that particular analyzer, the audio spectrum. Now you can also use one called waveform, audio waveform. It works only slightly differently, so I'm going to apply that on here for you so you can see it. Audio waveform, there's nothing completely new about this thing from the other one. The only difference is that I believe this one actually applies it more evenly across the line, the effect that it gives. So max height, let's boost it up. Let's apply it to a path. And we'll leave the colors. It's more appropriate for a heart, right? Just the thickness. So this one's a little more uniform with the way that it applies it around the shape. Kind of see how that rolls out. Again, it has similar options with how much you show, like displayed samples you can reduce.
Whoa!
So it can get really trippy. And then we can also change its shape. So that was that one. This is the digital one. And this is the dots. Similar to the other one, but again, this one utilizes, each line kind of represents like it's a duplicate-ish of the whole spectrum that's playing at the same time. The other one uses the whole line to represent different frequencies. This one just keeps them all in alignment together. So again, it's kind of another fun special effect tool that you can use to your advantage for, again, giving visuals to something that is a visual audio. So you can play off of that, you know, if you want to, if you see a place where it might work. Again, they both work a little bit differently, but kind of similar. The other way you can also work with animating audio, another great way to do it is called converting audio to keyframes that I wanted to show you. So as far as working with that, let me turn off these effects for these particular layers for a minute. And actually, let me leave this layer up. I love this little one. Little dancing thing. Okay, we're going to leave that alone. But if we want to add in, let's say we want to take one of our audio tracks and convert it into keyframes so that we can actually use the shape or volume levels in the audio to change transformation values in another visual layer. So I'm going to take one of my module sounds, one of these weird things, and I'm going to take it and go up to Animation, go to Keyframe Assistant, and convert audio to keyframes. Now, when you do that action, it will drop a brand new layer on the top of your layer stack called Audio Amplitude, and it's going to be red, like this. And inside this layer, I want you to see what it does, or it's done. It has 3 layers inside, a left channel, a right channel, and both channels. And those are just indicative of the audio, okay? And what it lays inside is a long string of keyframes. See that? That's just keyframes all lined up next to each other like a solid block. You can't really tell what's going on in those visually because this is a non-visual layer. It's just represented by an empty object on screen called a null object. But if you want to see what's actually occurring with this, you want to open something for this called the graph editor. So I'm going to open that up. That's this little icon right here. And when I turn on the graph editor, what it actually shows is a velocity curve for all the keyframes. Basically, it shows a difference in values between each one without saying it much further or much deeper than that. So if I look at it over here, this is an actual exact mapping of my audio clip based on audio frequency levels. So it's dropped a keyframe, which is represented by each of these little square blocks connected by lines. And what that gives me an idea of for After Effects is that I can use these value changes between each one to animate an effect of an object. So we're going to use it to change the scale of an object in a second. We're going to link it together. So first thing I want to do is find the object that I want to link it to. So we're going to go to our little friendly butterfly object. So I'm going to drag this audio amplitude layer all the way down to where my little butterfly thing is. This little guy right here. And tell you what though, let's animate it to something first that doesn't move so you can see this a little more clearly. So I'm going to drop in just one new shape layer real fast. Empty shape layer, draw in a simple shape. Okay. And maybe move in the anchor point. Where is that anchor point? Whoops. There it is right there. Put it in the center. Okay. All right. So got that position on screen, and I've got my audio amplitude. So what I'm going to open up is I'm going to open up my audio amplitude layer, and I'm going to have my shape layer open, and I'm going to go into my shape layer and go into its transform options under its contents. And I wanted to change its scale. That's what I said I wanted to be controlled by the audio. So what's going to happen is that the scale is going to sporadically change according to those audio frequency changes. So it sounds or looks like it's changing according to the audio changes. So here we go. So I've got that active. Now to link them together, you do need to do this. You have to activate something called an expression inside of After Effects. So I'm going to hold down the Option key, or Alt, and click on the stopwatch icon next to Scale in this case. And it expands down a little option area for expressions for an object. This is actually what's normally used in After Effects for creating scripting languages, for doing all kinds of tight-knit together editing. But we're just going to use it to link together properties. So I've got this extended for my scale, and I'm going to use this little twirly icon that's called a pick whip. When you drag it out, you can connect it to different items to allow this property that it extends from to be controlled by another item, which is also what's called parenting inside of animation, where you allow another object to control another object. So, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this pick whip and I'm going to drag it down to the slider for my dual channel audio. So I'm going to drag this down and put it right over the word slider. Let it go. And now what I'm going to do is run my playback over that object. Now see how it's kind of changing shape over time by itself? So that's being controlled by those frequency keyframes we generated from our audio amplitude layer. Now it's not very dramatic, right? Like that's kind of tiny. And that's because our audio amplitude is a much smaller unit measurement system than our actual scale measurement for an object. So I'm going to change the audio for a second. So go down to your audio slider, turn on your graph editor. And I'm going to click on the word slider to select all of the keyframes in here. When I do that, a bounding box appears around all of the keyframes, a little transform box. So I'm going to grab this little white node right here and drag it up. to stretch out the amplification. And what it does is that it's extending the amount of units it takes to move between each of these keyframes. So it's just changing up the way they're measured. So look over here on the sidebar, there's numbers being measured over here on the left to indicate the change in value that you're exceeding. So now I'm at 100 units. So the highest keyframe will now make it shift 100 units in scale if I want it to. And notice on screen up there above in the comp window, the object is getting bigger, right? So let's go ahead and drop it at about 250 units. And now hit the playback. All right, so now that object is directly controlled by the audio of that track. Pretty wild, right? And again, it's following every single keyframe that's listed inside this little amplification frequency, okay? So it's following it to the T, quite literally. So if you have really clean audio, like for an instrument, it's a much more stable looking change. But again, this audio track is so crazy with the amount of effects and things that are happening that this is what the effect of it is a really insane looking object. So,
Could you do it to the audio waveform, like when you make that into an animation and then you apply the keyframes to that sort of thing?
you could try to layer it up. Like you could make this affect the entire audio waveform layer so that it shrinks and grows the entire shape of the layer itself that the audio waveform is attached to. And yeah, you could double it up. I think if you wanted to, there's a way to do that as well. You can also make this, again, you can do color shifting with the audio now. So I could link it up to a color and I could make the color shift according to the audio changes over time if I wanted to. So you can get a lot of really fun things. And that's just from using this little, the little pick whip guy from in here. Here we are. That little guy right there.
And that's in any of the transformation options, right?
That's in anything that has a stopwatch in After Effects. So you can access the expressions controller. So you can link this. You always link it back to what you want it to be controlled by. So that's the order you go by. So whatever has the keyframe changes, that's what you want to drag it to.
Okay.
Basically.
And then for the amplitude, where did you get the actual layer?
So to get the audio amplitude layer, that was the question. If you want to get that, that's converting an audio track to keyframes. So if you want to get that, you find the audio you want to change, select it, go up to animation, keyframe assistant, convert audio to keyframes. And it will drop into the top of your timeline. It will always put at the top a new layer that says audio amplitude, and it'll be red every time.
And that's the one when you look at the keyframes, it's like a straight line.
Yeah, and that's this guy down here, wherever I put it, right here. Yeah, and whenever you open it up, it just looks like a long string of endless keyframes, because it is. But it makes more sense when you look at it in the graph editor, because that's what's actually occurring inside each keyframe. So it's just this is a much better visualization of what's actually going on, since there's no real like values that you can understand here except what the slider number is doing.
And so do you have audio from that track anymore, or is that just keyframes? Like
This is just a duplicate. It makes a duplicate of it and keeps it in line with your audio track that you made it from.
Okay.
So what you don't want to do is you don't want to slide this around on the timeline separate from that audio track that you made it from.
Yeah.
Then you get problems because then they're out of sync. Which brings me to a great point if you want to combine layers together. It's the perfect place to throw that in. If you ever find that you've got so many tracks of one kind and you really want them to be kind of more contained, After Effects typically, as we've experienced, like stacking is the method, right, that you do most stuff in here. And it's always, everything is on its own. But if you need a little more containment, or let's say you want multiple, like, you need multiple animated tracks to show through one mask, right? Like when we track matte, we can only track matte one layer underneath, right? And then otherwise you have to like duplicate your mask however many times over to deal with it. So rather than doing that, let's combine some stuff. So let's say I want to take all these audio tracks, right? Like all of my audio and drag it into one track together, okay? So I'm just going to do that real quick. So I'm going to select all of my audio tracks down here at the bottom. I'm going to make sure they're all unmuted and all ready. So I've got them all selected, and I'm going to go up to where it says Layer, and go down to the bottom, and there's an option that says Pre-Compose. I'm going to click on that, and what pre-composing does is that it's going to take all of your selected layers currently, and it's going to convert them into a separate comp that you can use in your project. Now this does not permanently flatten your work, it just hides it. So let me show you. So I'm going to call this the audio comp, and I'm going to go ahead and say OK. Now all of my audio layers just got shrunk down into this brown track at the bottom. Everybody see this little brown track down here? Little tannish track. Notice the icon for it is completely different. It's this little multicolored icon.
Because it's like a composition.
Exactly. It is exactly the same as your comp that you created when you started your project. So the cool thing is that if I double click on the name of this, inside are all of my audio layers kept. Now, again, the benefit of this is that now I have just one track layer to deal with in my main playback area instead of a dozen of them. Now I can still see this is the generic audio waveform for everything inside there, okay? So now you can kind of see what that looks like. But you still have access to those things. You can now transform the whole layer, but it makes it easier if you want to manage it separately, right?
Can you still go into it and, like, if you wanted to animate the specific?
Yeah. Yeah, you can still go in here and you can still deal with them. Now keep in mind, when you do put them inside a comp like that, again, they will be separated from the rest of the gang visually. Like,
So
I
it's
can't.
harder to match it.
So it becomes harder to match. So you want to make sure that if you're going to do that with something, that it's just ready for that.
Okay.
And you're really what you're doing is helping simplify your layer timeline area.
For when you're finishing up.
Yeah, for when you're finishing up. And there's lots of great uses for that. Like, this is also a great way to where I can now apply a single special effect to everything.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Which is
that's
great
another
for
benefit of
anybody.
pre-comping. You can now evenly apply it to all of those things, and they all get hit. Really easy.
Is there any way to, like, later move all of those back into this position?
Yeah, I mean, it's not hard. You can just go in the comp, like that separate one we just made. I can select all of this. Command C, come back in here, Command V, and paste them all back in. See? Easy peasy.
And then get rid of that comp.
And then get rid of the comp out of the timeline. So, you know, you just decide, like, whenever you need it for temporary purposes or for long-term purposes, what it serves. But that's a great thing to know how to do, though, for applying special effects to multiple things, especially if you want to have, like, multiple animated layers show through one track mat. That's a great thing to do. Nest them all together and let them play. Again, saves on layer space inside the timeline, too. Okay, I don't think there's anything else I want you guys to be clued in on in terms of working. Oh, there was. Before I forget, I'm sorry. One last thing. In terms of playing with an animation tool, there's one called Motion Sketch. I do want you to see this because it's kind of fun. And I like fun. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take our little jittery friend here in the center of the screen, and we're going to actually draw a live animated pathway for him to follow over time. Okay? So instead of him just sitting here kind of static in the center, you know, it's going to be kind of like a battle for this other one that's kind of floating around like a crazy butterfly. So we're going to make this one kind of fly around and dodge him or something, okay? So to get that going, what you want to do is you go up to Window, and you want to go down to an option here that turns on a panel called Motion Sketch. All right, so you turn on Motion Sketch, and that pops up in the lower right of your screen, and it's called Motion Sketch. And these are the options it gives you. These are really basic. Like you set the capture speed, 100% by the way represents normal speed. You can smooth the amount, you can add smoothing so that as it records your movements, it smooths as it goes, like if you round a corner. The way it displays temporarily as you draw can be set. So I would suggest leaving it as wireframe so that it will allow you to draw at normal pace. If you turn that off, sometimes it can get really laggy in the system or crash, and you don't want that. So leave it at wireframe. And then below that, it will tell you the limit for which it will do the animation for or record. So in this case, 15 seconds is how much it can record into the system before it stops recording movement. So what I'm going to do is the first thing you want to make sure of is that the object you're going to animate, make sure that its anchor point is located inside of the object, please. Or we're going to have that craziness we had with the butterfly object where it rotates around that thing. So make sure it's at the center. Use that little pan behind tool up at the top and drag your anchor point back to the middle of your shape layer. All right, now here's where the fun begins. So I'm going to set my timer here to the very beginning. And I'm going to hit the Start Capture button. And I'm going to click and drag this object. Wherever you click is where it starts, by the way. So I'm going to click and drag. And as I go, it will react or move to all of my movements as well until the timer's up.
Can you stop before?
Yep. I can stop at any time if I let go of the mouse. All right. Now let me tell you what just happened. So what you see on screen looks like a lot of scribble, and it is.
Those are all keyframes?
Those are all keyframes set to a motion path, is what they call this recorded mess on the screen. So this represents the directional pathway that I just drew, which obviously it's kind of chaotic. That's on purpose. But every single little square that you see here, those represent keyframes. Yeah, so there's, yeah, it looks like constellation. Isn't that awesome? There's probably an art project in that, I'm pretty sure. So, but you can kind of see where things go. Now, let's see it do the playback, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and hit the playback. There goes my object, following the same pathway. So it just followed that entire pathway, and it pretty much did it according to the speed and velocity I moved my mouse at. Pretty cool, huh? Now that can be a lot of fun when you don't want to animate something like that manually, right? With like dropping keyframes every few seconds. This can save you a little bit of trouble on that part. But it does allow you to get more natural motion out of something if you want to move it with the mouse instead. Or if you've really got like tight-knit movements that just doing it by hand by automatically dropping keyframes or trying to set them manually just doesn't work out. So this can be way more entertaining. But now, yeah, now you can kind of see like where the object went to, where it's going, and where it ended. All right. I think that's where we're going to call it quits on terms of looking at advanced animation you can play with. There's way more out there. But this is, of course, a few things that you can toy with on the fly. I encourage you guys to experiment with it, have fun with it, and see what you come up with. All right, we'll go ahead and stop it right there.